That and so much more. Right now on America This Week. Hi, folks. I hope you're staying healthy and safe as coronavirus continues to ravage the U.S. and the world. I promise to bring you fair and unbiased information on America This Week. I've tried to keep the focus on the show on the latest news and information, this war on the deadly virus, and I have to make sure that other people are doing the same. While I watch my cable news colleagues on both sides of the aisle throwing around blame and accusations like water, I've tried my best to keep the politics on the sidelines, at least for now. That said, holding China's feet to the fire isn't political. There's something wrong with what we're being told from China. I mean, is it just me? Or is it odd that China's first doctor who warned the world about the novel coronavirus was visited by the communist regime and warned to shut up or he'd be jailed for spreading false rumors? P.S. That doctor later died from coronavirus, and he was just 36 years old. Is it just me, or is it strange that another whistleblower, Ain Fen, a young woman who worked in the Wuhan Central Hospital and who warned about the epidemic, went missing on April 1st? Is it just me, or is it peculiar that as tens of thousands of people are dying in New York, in Rome, in Madrid, and in Paris, each of those cities are thousands of miles away from Wuhan? Meanwhile, just a couple hundred miles away from Wuhan, Beijing has just lost 7 people, 7, and Shanghai, 8 people. Now, is it just me, or is it curious that celebrities like Tom Hanks, athletes like Kevin Durant, musicians like Pink, and politicians like Boris Johnson are getting coronavirus? Meanwhile, we've yet to hear about a Chinese official nor celebrity to have gotten the virus. Is it just me, or does it tick you off too that I'm hosting this show from another empty restaurant in America, Tavern and Table, usually packed with people looking to enjoy a beer or a burger on the river, now shuttered, hundreds of workers, hourly workers let go, while China has just declared she's open for business? Is it just me, or is it shady that China did, in fact, purchase 2.2 billion masks in January as the Wuhan flu made its way to Italy, to Spain, and to America? 2.2 billion masks, more than one for each Chinese citizen, while our doctors and nurses here in the U.S. are reusing dirty masks. Shady indeed. You know what? China is shady. They're a communist regime. We should hold China accountable. We should dig further into how this pandemic actually started. It's just not sitting well with me that someone ate a bat in a wet market. They've been eating bats in China for centuries. No, this virus is novel indeed, and I think the Chinese government knows a lot more than what they're telling us. Now, is it just me, or do you want to know more and want to hold China accountable too? Stick around. You'll have your chance to weigh in, because I'm not letting this go. Okay, let's bring in the nation's premier virologist, also the head of the coronavirus task force, Dr. Fauci. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Fauci. You are all over the place, and we're honored to have you here. We've got 44 million people across the country watching. The wet markets, sir, the Chinese wet markets, I've heard you say they should be shut down. How do we make that happen?
I think the way to have that happen is to put international global pressure on them. It's very clear that the animal-human interface that occurs in those wet markets have already literally, in the last 18 years, from SARS back in 2002 to the 2012 MERS, we've had now 3 major outbreaks: SARS, MERS, and now this terrible novel coronavirus outbreak, due to that interface where animals that are put into contact with humans that harbor in our reservoir for these viruses, when you have that close contacts, it jumps species. I know it's going to be very difficult from a cultural and other standpoint, traditions of that kinds of markets, but they really need to look at that very seriously and try to put some restrictions and restraints on that. And if they don't want to do it, I think we need to have a lot of international pressure from the rest of the world, the WHO and others, to see if they can do that.
Dr. Fauci, are we sure that this happened, not by accident? Let's say it did happen by accident, but are we sure that this was a result of a person at one of these wet markets consuming one of these animals that was either live or recently slaughtered? Is this how it happened? Or, there are those, and I'm more and more, by the way, let me clarify this. I watch every single minute of every briefing that you guys are talking about. I'm a student of this virus. The more I read about it, the more I hear about it, the more celebrities that are dying, the more actors that are dying, more athletes, the more world leaders that are dying or contracting it, tells me this is something different. How sure are you that this came from animal to human outside of a biological lab?
Well, we're pretty certain of that. And the reason we are is that when you look at the evolution of the mutations that occur in animals like bats and other intermediary hosts, you see a natural progression of mutations that lead to the one that allowed it to jump species. So that was going on in the wild. Clearly, we didn't appreciate it, but when you go back and you look at the genetic sequences of those viruses, it's more than highly suggestive that this was just a natural event of jumping species accidentally because of close human to animal interface, as opposed to something that came out of a laboratory.
Well, sir, couldn't it come out of a laboratory, human to animal jump species in the laboratory setting?
You know, there was never impossible that happened, but it is extraordinarily unlikely. When you look at the history of this outbreak and the history of SARS, very similar, a bit of a different virus, same class, same coronavirus. When you look at what happened with MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, it was the same thing. With SARS, it was from a bat to an animal called a civet cat, which is served and eaten at festive undertakings in China. That's how we got SARS. With MERS, it was a bat to a camel, and that's why it outbroke in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. And it is almost certain that that's exactly what happened this time.
Sure. You know, and I agree with you. And look, I'm an economist. I'm not a virologist, but let's have a conversation. You guys do models, and modeling is a guesswork. And you look at what the data returns, and you see how good or how well your model has predicted the future. Here's my problem with all of this, sir, and I think I speak for a lot of people. For this to start in Wuhan, China, the Chinese tell us there's only 3,000, 3,500 deaths so far in the whole continent, the whole Chinese state. 8 or 9 cases in Beijing, 7 or 8 cases in Shanghai. New York City, they're dying by the hundreds per day, and that's 7,500 miles away. How could cities like Beijing and Shanghai have under 10 deaths only a few hundred miles away from Wuhan?
It's a good question. We have always had a difficulty with really feeling very confident in the data that comes from China. I mean, we generally assume, with some cautious holding back and skepticism, that the data are completely accurate. But it's very clear they had a major outbreak. Right now, we had our team that was sponsored by the WHO and included people from the CDC and the NIH and other international agencies that went there and saw what was going on in China. The exact number of deaths, you know, that's not something I feel completely confident in, but very clearly it's different there now. They have very well controlled their outbreak. They did it by rather draconian means that we would not be able to implement in the United States. But getting back to your original question, I don't have complete confidence in the numbers of total deaths that they're reporting.
You know, let's talk a little bit about hydroxychloroquine. Now, the president's been taking a lot of heat. And again, I want this to be non-political. I just want to talk the science, sir, and you're the right guy for that. Hydroxychloroquine, you've warned against, I guess, prophylactically taking this drug, that there may be some side effects that we don't know. But, I mean, a lot of us out here believe if the drug was tested for lupus and some sort of rheumatoid arthritis, don't we know the side effects that it may cause? So why wouldn't we use this for something that's killing people?
Well, it is being used, and it's being used under 2 different pathways. One is an off-label prescribing by physicians, and that has to be an agreement and an understanding between a physician and a patient that there are certain risks because, by the way, the dosages that you'll be using for coronavirus are far greater than the dosages that you use for malaria or that you use for autoimmune diseases such as lupus. Secondly, as I've said many times, the information that this has a beneficial effect is really scant. There are some studies that are not really the kinds of well-controlled studies that we generally use to make definitive decisions that suggest that it might work. There are other studies that show that it doesn't work at all. So given the fact that we have no
sorry,
other...
I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to ask you this. I look at the scientists, I look at the doctors, and I have to ask you this question. You can refuse to answer this, but sir, you have a wife and 3 daughters. If one of them were gravely ill with COVID-19, would you recommend them trying hydroxychloroquine?
Well, my daughters are adults. What I would do is I would tell them to make their own decision. Myself, personally, if I were infected, I would want to go into a clinical trial. I would want to do it under the auspices of a clinical trial, a well-controlled clinical trial. With regard to my family, they're all adults. They would make their own decision based on a discussion between them and their physician and a weighing of the risk-benefit. I think everybody has a different viewpoint, and you've got to respect the individual viewpoints of people. That's the reason why I do not criticize people who, together with their physician, make a decision that they may want to try something. But in the same breath, I have to say, there is not definitive evidence that it works. And we are not quite sure yet of the toxicities because you're using it in a different disease and you're using it at a much higher dose. Ultimately, as the information gets accumulated, we will get a better idea. And also, I think importantly, in addition to the off-label use, there are randomized controlled trials that are looking at the safety and the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. So we will get the answer ultimately.
All right. Sir, you raised some eyebrows recently, and you're being very honest and fair. Someone asked you, when will America be back to normal? And your comment was something along the lines of, we'll probably never be back to normal, pre-COVID-19 normal. But give us a sense of what post-COVID-19 normal looks like for America, in your opinion.
Well, I didn't want my words to be taken out of context. When I said we'll never really get back to normal, I didn't mean that all of a sudden we're going to be abnormal forever. I meant that our sensitivity to the need to be prepared for these kinds of unexpected, catastrophic global outbreaks, we will now have that imprinted on us forever. And I think care that people take in addressing how one responds to emerging infectious diseases is different. That's what I mean when I said we'll never get back to the same. Getting back to some degree of normality, that will come. We will get over this. It may not just be in the next month or two because we have to be concerned and prepared for the possibility that it might cycle. It might come back next season if we get it under control, which I think we will get it under control within the next several weeks to a month or so. But we need to make sure we're prepared.
I have about a minute or so, and I just want you to give us a little bit of sense. I mean, will there be, granted, you're not a politician, you're not an economist, you're a virologist. When would it be smart for us to go back to, let's say, a baseball stadium sitting next to someone very close to me?
It's tough to predict, but the guidelines are extended for 30 days till the end of April. We will have a considerably amount more information by then as to whether that curve has gone steeply down. As it does, we'll have a graded, progressive return to some form of normality. Whether that will include ballparks where people are sitting next to each other is difficult to say right now. But I think we'll gradually phase into that. There are different ways of doing that. You could have ball games in which you don't fill up a complete stadium and you keep a certain distance. I'm sure that the directors of the Major League Baseball associations are probably considering that right now.
Right. Yeah. And you're a fan of sports, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Really appreciate it. I'm just thinking there's so many things coming up. We have summer, we have baseball, we have two conventions. We have two national conventions. That's a lot of people. Would you recommend that the RNC and the DNC cancel their national conventions?
No, I don't think I can comment on that right now. I really think we need to see where we are at the time that those conventions are being planned. Right now, I think we're moving in the right direction, but we evaluate this daily on a day-by-day basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you. Well, she's a real estate mogul and one of the sharks on ABC's Shark Tank. Barabara Corcoran is here to talk about how small businesses, boy, how they're struggling and how they can survive through the coronavirus. Barbara, welcome. First of all, I read a piece that you had said that most of the small businesses that you invest in on Shark Tank likely will not survive the coronavirus. Please explain.
Absolutely. I probably invest in close to 80 businesses in Shark Tank. And if I had to count my numbers and make a wild guess, I would say that maybe 10 will survive and they'll do very well. We'll actually become stronger as a result of it. But everyone else will not make the ends meet. Their initial moves as to how they responded was not fast enough, nor was it intelligent enough. And they are just not going to make it through, I'm sure of it, yeah.
You know, there's a lot of confusion. There's certainly a lot of money being floated around. You know, is it the right kind of money? In other words, there's a lot of top-down money coming for big corporations, some tax deferrals. Is there enough money for small businesses to access to stay afloat during this period, however long it may be?
Well, I've been talking to all of my businesses over the last couple of weeks, and I can tell you that the problem isn't that they totally get it, that they're going to get their hands on money to float payroll. All they have to do is not let anybody go. But when I actually look at the profiles of the businesses, most of them didn't have the ability to stretch and wait for those checks to come in. So they've had to let a lot of people go. And is the money being well used from the top down? Yes, to some degree, but it's not fast enough. I think the single biggest benefit that's being offered to people who are owning small businesses is the ability to float payroll through June 15th, and the loan gets forgiven after they get the loan, but nobody has their hands on the money, and that's where most of the problems are lying right now.
You know, Barbara, one of the other things I heard, and I don't even know if I have a question regarding this, but there are people who are not going to be evicted if they don't pay their rent and or mortgage right now. I understand that. But there are two lanes that this may end up. So you may end up owing a lump sum whenever this period of forgiveness is. Now, how in the world are people going to be able to afford lump sums? All you're doing is delaying kind of a knockout punch, are we not?
Well, you put your finger on it. What's actually going to happen is if there is a bubble left, or a balloon, as we call it in the trade, no one's going to pay that off. No one is going to have that money, and it's going to roll over into some other vehicle, some extension line from the federal government. They'll just print up more money. But the bottom line is right now, the key is on mortgages and rent payers who feel like they can't meet their rent is to take the immediate pressure off. And to that degree, or for that purpose, I should say, what the stimulus package is doing is appropriate. What the governors are doing state by state, almost every state in the union now doesn't demand, won't allow evictions. And that's tremendous peace of mind for people. So although it's not enough and it seems unrealistic at the tail end, the fact of the matter is when we get to the tail end, it will be reshuffled again, like shuffling the deck of cards and giving people a motion to stay.
You know, very quickly, we only have about a half a minute or so, Barbara. Appreciate your time. So many small businesses. I walk around, Charles, so many small businesses. One piece of advice that you can give, and I know this is hard to do, just give us one piece of advice for a small business who may not have a lot of cash to burn through during this period.
I have to name three things very quickly. You have to size up your revenue, see what you're going to lose, and make means of replacing them. You have to reinvent how you did your business. You have to renegotiate with your landlord and bring your rent down immediately, and you have to draw down your credit line. Because I know, as building a big business over the years, every time I needed my credit line, it wasn't there for me. So that's exactly the attitude that all of my great entrepreneurs are taking, and that's the advice I'm giving them.
Barabara Corcoran, we really appreciate your time. ABC Shark Tank, everybody. Congressman Dan Crenshaw joins me now. Congressman, great to have you on. Appreciate your time, sir. We've been pretty hard on China on the show so far, but I'm really ticked off. I think they've they've done a disservice to the world and specifically the United States. Sir, what does U.S. Congressman from Texas have to say to China about what's going on?
Hey, well, everything that needs to be said, and this needs to be a bipartisan effort. Look, China acted terribly in this. They deliberately hid the virus. We know that now. They've deliberately withheld information. They continue to withhold information. They continue to prevent scientists from going in and helping understand the virus so that we can continue to combat it. We also know that they withheld exports from 3M because those are manufactured in China, N95 masks, withheld those exports from coming here. They choked off our supply chains, and they instigated propaganda against the United States. And of course, our progressive left friends helped them with that and continue to help them with that. They've also corrupted the World Health Organization from the inside out. The World Health Organization was repeating Chinese claims that travel restrictions weren't necessary in late January, or that human-to-human interaction isn't how this disease is spread. And they spread these kind of things. It's deeply corrupt, and we have to make them pay for it.
Congressman, you wrote a book, I think it's out this week, Fortitude, American Resilience in the Era of Outrage. And I want to focus in on that last word, outrage. So we've had the last couple of years of outrage, left outrage at the right outrage at the left. Do we now focus an outrage at another foe? Can China now be the new target of our outrage, and should it be?
Yeah, if the Democrats will somehow pull themselves back from the brink of this hyperpartisanship, then yes, maybe we could finally have a common enemy, or at the very least make the common enemy the actual pandemic. I think there was a time, around March, where we were getting to that point where there was a bit more of a coming together, and then that all fell apart. I think that really fell apart after Nancy Pelosi, in terribly bad faith, blew up the negotiations for the economic rescue package. Ever since, I've seen the media act absolutely insane. I mean, absolutely insane. And it only appears to be getting worse. That outrage culture is an infectious disease in and of itself. And we've had it for a long time, but I would hope that we could see that it's not what we need right now when we have an actual infectious disease ravaging the country and an actual economic crisis. The last thing we need is this petty partisan finger pointing that's going on. I mean, just for example, the obsession that the press has with President Trump touting a malaria drug, hydroxychloroquine, to be used is so utterly insane. It's so beyond insane that this is what they're focused on, that they're so focused on blaming him for this. When objectively the facts just don't marry up with their thesis on this, it's indicative of the fact that we're not shedding this outrage culture the way we need to. And I wrote this book because of petty outrage culture. I didn't write it for a time like this. However, the lessons are deeply applicable to a time like this and deeply necessary. I don't like that I came out with a book this week. That's not, if I had to do it all over again, I would have done it at a different time. But also, I'm proud that the lessons that I put forth in this book are out this week. I think people will find them very deep and meaningful and useful, and probably not quite what you think they are.
Congressman, I tend to live in that outrage world too. I'm a host of a television show that's highly political, and we try not to be partisan, but sometimes we get there. I'll tell you what my outrage is, sir. We're going to go, but my outrage is that I'm hosting this show from an empty restaurant and bar. I'm outraged that there are 15 million restaurant workers that could be out of work in the next couple of weeks. I'm really outraged at what's going on with China. I want to dig deeper into it. Dan Crenshaw, Congressman, thank you so much for your time. Again, that book is Fortitude, American Resilience in the Era of Outrage. Sir, thank you for your time. Ahead on America This Week, I'm talking with the founder of the Faith and Freedom Coalition, Ralph Reed. His take as the nation prepares to celebrate Easter in the middle of a pandemic.
United we stand, we never fall.
And we want to invite you to join us for a new special called America This Week, United We Stand. You have questions, and we want to get you those answers. It will stream Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on all Sinclair Station websites. Check your local station's listing to see when it will air.
America, one nation, From Florida to St. Louis to Seattle. America This Week, America's fastest growing political show, delivers rough and tumble political arguments.
On the left, this new embrace of socialism.
The whole thing is ridiculous.
Hard-edged opinions.
The media let Joe Biden get away with his first big lie.
They can come after me all they want, but they're going to have to kill me if they want me to stop defending the president.
Tough topic debates.
Destabilization in the Middle East, more chaos and more terrorism.
Unless we get away from all of this hatred, we're going to destroy ourselves.
We have to solve the border problems.
The wall is a big chunk of what we're talking about.
America This Week reveals the topics and issues that pulse throughout America. Investigates stories revealing toxic forever chemicals in water supplies.
My family was poisoned. My child was poisoned. I have been poisoned.
There he is, over here, straight ahead.
Chaos at the southern border.
Go, 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 go.
Cartels, rape, gangs, and violence.
So you guys are both hitmen?
America This Week investigates the facts and the falsehoods and relentlessly seeks the truth on your behalf.
I'm Eric Bolling. Join me for a fascinating look at America This Week. Okay, let's bring in a good friend of mine. We used to do a lot of TV together, not so much recently, but Ralph Reed is the founder and chairman of Faith and Freedom Coalition. Sir, thank you very much for joining us on this high holy of weekends. Could you talk to us a little bit about the importance of prayer with things going on the way they are right now?
Well, I think, Eric, this is a time for people to really return to their roots and faith in God. It's a time to pray. The time to pray for the leaders of our country, starting with President Trump and Vice President Pence. The others who are advising them, we need them to have supernatural knowledge, discernment, understanding, and insight that is beyond their own human ability. Obviously, we would have all preferred that we not be dealing with these circumstances. But I do see a silver lining in it, Eric, in this sense. I think when the things that we have built our lives on, and in many ways unintentionally turned into idols, our careers, our jobs, our investment accounts, our 401ks, when all those things are either kicked away or they're put in jeopardy in literally the blink of an eye, it forces us to put our trust and confidence in the things that are not built on shifting sand of this earth, but the things that are eternal and transcendent, and those things that are the same yesterday, today, and forever. And for me as a Christian, that's faith in Jesus Christ. And I believe that this holy week and this holy Easter weekend, and true for our Jewish brothers and sisters who are celebrating Passover, you're going to see a surge and a flooding of online platforms and websites to participate in worship services like you've never seen.
Let's talk about that other part, though. Ralph, you mentioned the things that are of this world, of the shifting sand. Leadership is important. President Trump is the leader of the free world, variably. So let's talk a little bit about you and other evangelicals suggest that Trump punished China for what we're going through right now. Could you elaborate a little?
Yeah, well, as I write in my book, For God and Country, The Christian Case for Donald Trump, I spend a lot of time defending Trump, but that wasn't really the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book was to defend the faith community, who have been called every name in the book: spiritual frauds, hypocrites, people who sold their souls for 30 pieces of silver in order to gain access to power. I mean, they've been pilloried and maligned in unspeakable and disgraceful ways for supporting this president. And I think they've been vindicated because he's turned out to be the most pro-life, pro-religious freedom, and pro-Israel president, certainly in my lifetime, arguably in American history. With regard to China, All I've said, Eric, is that given the fact that this virus originated in the Wuhan province, and given the fact that the Chinese clearly deceived the rest of the international community about the depth and breadth of its threat, and the fact that the World Health Organization even issued a public finding that it was not transmitted human to human based on Chinese representations. What I've said is I think there needs to be a reckoning. Right now, we need to be focused on saving lives and eliminating this infection and reducing the scale of the infection, which we're doing by following the president's guidelines on social distancing. But when we get past this immediate crisis, I think the entire international public health infrastructure needs a second look, and we need to kind of change the way we're doing business. If we have regimes that are secretive, that are dictatorships, that are not transparent, and they're threatening the rest of the world with these kind of pandemics, then I think we may need to look at some new rules of the road.
Right, and I don't think there's anything anti-Christian or non-Christ-like to hold people accountable for doing things that are deadly and likely illegal. Sir, I only have about 30 seconds. If you would just keep the answer to this. What do you say to those pastors out there, and there are several of them who are still holding services at this high holy time? What do you, in other words, putting people together when we're being told not to? What are your words to them?
Eric, I think they're in a very distinct minority, and what I would say is you have an obligation not only to the kingdom of God to serve him, but you also have an obligation as a citizen of the United States to obey the law and show respect for the advice and the counsel and the directives and orders of our government officials. And I think right now that means abiding by these social distancing and public health protocols so that we can get back to church in person as quickly as possible.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Ralph Reed, thank you very much. Good friend of mine, a long time. Happy Easter, Ralph. And now let's bring in two great friends of the show, Amisha Cross from the left, I guess you would call that, and Dr. Sebastian Gorka from the right. Guys, let's talk a little bit about Ralph Reed. Ralph Reed, who's the Faith and Freedom Coalition founder, said that President Trump should hold China accountable for what's going on around the globe right now. I'll start with you, Amisha. Your thoughts about whether or not President Trump shows true leadership and pushing back against China, and should he?
I definitely think that China needs to be held accountable. At this point, the question is, what is within our privy to do in terms of China? We know that China hasn't been a good faith partner for years. This isn't something new or novel to the coronavirus. My biggest question, though, is what is President Trump going to do now? Coronavirus is here in the United States. And as a matter of fact, it is ravaging the African-American community, which was something I'm glad he actually spoke about during his most recent press conference. But I think that him taking real charge of what's happening in the United States right now is what most Americans want to see.
What do you say, Sebastian? What's the right leadership role for President Trump coming in, I guess, after the slope starts to go on the backside of this? What do we do with China?
Well, I think the first thing is we don't try and turn this into a tool for ethnic divisiveness. So the biggest thing that we can do to set things right after the curb is broken, after people are treated and the worst of the virus is over, is to make sure that we are never, ever put in this position again. China has benefited from a globalizing policy elite that thinks it's fine to outsource U.S. jobs to other countries and decimate manufacturing in the U.S. On top of that, since Henry Kissinger convinced Nixon to open to China in the 70s, we have created a system where, look at the figures, more than 85% of our antibiotics are created in China. The biggest way that we can rectify all of this is to make sure that America is never, ever beholden to the communists in Beijing. If we do that, everything will be much, much safer, and a future pandemic of this nature will be dealt with far more easily.
So for some reason, you both of you, the World Health Organization has become this political football in the United States. We fund it by far the most of any country in the world. Somewhere around $100 million of our money goes to the World Health Organization. Now, Misha, they've proven to be completely wrong. They tweeted that this was not human-to-human transferable. as recently as in January, and they were January 14th and for 15th, in fact. Is it time to defund? I know the president said he's going to pull back some of the funds. Is it time to completely defund the World Health Organization and pull ourselves out of it?
Absolutely not. Yes, the World Health Organization made a huge misstep when it comes to knowing how this pandemic was going to transfer. But then again, there were scientists across the globe who made that same assertion in early January. So it would not specifically just target the World Health Organization there. They have been spot on in several pandemics across SARS. When we're talking about, H1N1 and all the different variations of the flu, when we're talking about malaria, they have been right about so many things over the course of the past 40, 50 years. So I don't think now is the time to dismantle them at all.
Not sure I agree with you. Sebastian, I'll give you a final word on this. Defund World WHO permanently or temporarily?
Defund it until it stops becoming a useless hack front for the communists in China. Dr. Tedros at the top was elected in part by with the help of the communists. He has become a mouthpiece for Xi Jinping and the propaganda arm of the Communist Party in China. This is another useless UN body that actually spends more on personal travel for its staff than it does for medical equipment. It is corrupt to the core, like most of the UN, and should be defunded until it is fixed, if it ever can be, Eric.
The World Health Organization was a major player in eradicating HIV/AIDS. So I'm sorry, I just don't believe that that's something that we should really.
Now,
really
you're
be
entitled to your opinion, but if you like Chinese
we did run out of time,
it.
guys. We did run out of time. We will bring this up again because it's not going anywhere. As recently as this week, President Trump said he was pulling back funding from the WHO, at least temporarily. Dr. Sebastian Gorka, Misha Krust, thank you guys always so much. We've gotten hundreds of questions about the coronavirus. Next, our doctor panel will clear up all the confusion. We're still listening, and we hear you. Keep calling 888-601-0032. That's toll free. This is your chance to ask questions, rant, rave about anything you want. Hundreds more calls flooded in this past week. Here's what some of you are telling us.
It's so nice to hear somebody unbiased. I'd have to say you are the modern-day Walter Cronkite. Keep up the great work.
Our president is working very hard. President Trump is working very hard to do everything he can to provide and make sure that all the protective devices are there and the respirators and everything.
I'm curious to know as to why no one's turning to the Lord for this help. If everyone would ask the Lord for some help and pray over this disease, I believe we could get rid of it.
Here's that number again, 888-601-0032. Again, it's toll free. It's your time to be heard, folks. Follow me on Twitter at Eric Bolling, ericbolling.com also, and we will make sure they hear you. All right, let's welcome back Dr. Dave Campbell, Chief Medical Correspondent at MSNBC's Morning Joe, and pandemic expert Dr. Dina Grayson. Thank you guys so much. Again, all our viewers are Twitter users. They're piling into the show. They have so many questions. And, you know, if I can just ask for a little bit of brevity, we can get a lot more questions in. Let me start with Worker Joe number 1. He wants to know about a sneeze. The bigger sneeze is we're hearing, you know, we remember Dr. Fauci talking about if there's a really huge sneeze, this virus can be transmitted up to 27 feet. What's the real working distance that we need to be safe? If we see someone sneeze in a grocery store, how far should I be away from him or her? Dave, I'll start with you. I'm sorry.
Well, I'll take that one. I like the 6 feet rule. It makes a lot of sense, particularly now that we have the recommendation to wear face covering in public. That would, of course, include being in the grocery store or elsewhere. And that speaks to the infectious load also, where the amount of virus that you are in contact with for this particular COVID-19 does not seem to